the people's president at final rest. At the Pei Korumbu ground, 2 kilometers from Dr. Kalam's hometown, Rameshwaram. Thousands gathered to pay their last respects. Many stationed themselves. Some climbed trees to catch their last glimpse of the much-loved former president. Prime Minister Narendra Modi saluted Dr. Kalam's tricolour-wrapped body. He touched the feet of Kalam's 99-year-old elder brother. Many chief ministers, union ministers and political leaders like Congress Vice President Rahul Gandhi were present, as were those who offered namaz over Dr. Kalam's final resting place. The traditional gun salute to the missile man rung out while the military band played the last post. The 3 service chiefs of the Indian Defence Forces saluted their former commander-in-chief. There were slogans and people waved the tricolour as a people's president was laid to rest.
Two journalists, one old, the other not so old. Both of us have spent some time covering President Kalam. Raj, you covered President Kalam in the formative years, when he was yet to become the kind of icon, the legend that he turned out to be eventually. Tell us, where did it all start? Did he set out to be a missile man?
He's got an extraordinary story. I mean, here was this young little boy born in Ramnathpuram, the very conservative temple town, a Muslim, and he experienced the first sign of bigotry over there itself.
Really?
Yeah, you know, he's probably about 6 or 7 years old, goes to a class, happens to sit next to a Brahmin boy, and the teacher says, "You two shouldn't be together," and he asks Kalam to leave. You know, but when you ask Kalam the story, he doesn't look at the negative. I think that's the trait.
Which is remarkable, because, you know, your early experiences often shape the kind of personality that you develop.
What happens is he remembers more than anything else, and he was narrating this to me with tears in his eyes, that there was another Brahmin who heard about the story and called Kalam home, got his reluctant wife to serve him a meal. Kalam remembers that more than anything else.
And, you know, talking of this, very few people know, the impression that people have of Kalam is that, you know, Kalam was a Muslim, but Kalam never wore his religion on his sleeve. But very few people know that he was a believer and he was a devout. I've had occasion to speak to people. He used to say, you know, the early morning Fajr prayers, even as president, almost every day without fail, that he fasted. And unlike the tamasha that you see now, where it is grand iftar parties, even when he was president, he held iftar parties, but it was for orphans. It was for the poor who couldn't afford it. You know, so that was the kind of person he was. And it perhaps stems from what you say, from his early, you know, how he reacted to that situation.
Javed, just fast forwarding, when you mentioned this, in 1994 when I was interviewing him, he had sort of just coming into prominence at that time. And the same impression I had, you know, I asked him this question about being a Muslim. Strangely, on that day, he was playing the veena at home. You know, he used to live only in a single room. Despite being the fact that he was at that time a secretary-level government officer who could have stayed in, you know, one of the best bungalows, he still had a single room. He maintained that simplicity. He had the veena and he had the Bhagavad Gita right next to that. And he insisted, when we, you know, looking at it, he said, "I read everything. I mean, I might be a devout Muslim," but he allowed the entire, you know, whatever else, all the breezes to blow of any religion that was there. He was truly secular in that sense.
Absolutely. And without making a great show about it, he didn't market either the fact that he came from extremely humble beginnings. You know, he never spoke about it. It's only now we know.
That's true.
It's only now we know that he was a boatman's son, that he sold newspapers.
And do you know what happened at one time? His father ran this boat. There was a cyclone, and the boat was destroyed. His sister, and he remembers that again, with great gratitude, sold her jewelry, pawned her jewelry to allow him to go to college. And college was Chennai, or Madras at that time. And here was this young boy who just sort of graduated with all the other problems that he had, struggling in college. When I spoke to his professor, who taught him at that time, he wasn't really, his professor confessed, and he said, there was nothing in Kalam that would tell me that he would excel. He really struggled, but the difference was that and this professor said that he had an extraordinary drive to overcome every obstacle that was there. So he struggled. The other came from his classmate. And, this trait he's never left. He was one of the hardest workers. And his classmate, who was his roommate, would complain that his light was on till 2 a.m. And he couldn't sleep in that same room that he shared with Kalam. So what he lacked in, say, overt talent, he made up through this dint of hard work, a sort of dogged perseverance that allowed him to tackle any issues that were there, to overcome that.
This is remarkable. You mentioned the fact that he used to stay in this one-room apartment. After he demitted office as President of India, the government took some time in arranging a bungalow for him. So he stayed in the cantonment, and he stayed in a one-room. He stayed in a small room, and his military attaché came and asked him, what is the kind of arrangement that we need to make? He said, just one room with a bathroom would do. And he stayed there. He wouldn't complain. He used to just eat in the mess. He was a very different kind of person.
In fact, I joked with him on this. He had just been nominated as president. And before that, he would always be in chappals. And he probably never had a suit. The only time, there was this story that he told me, that he was being feted in 1980 when he had launched India's first satellite launcher. A tremendous success at that point. And he was called by Mrs. Indira Gandhi and Satish Dhawan, who was the then chairman, to come and be felicitated. And he told Satish Dhawan, sir, I don't have a suit. What do I do? So Satish Dhawan, who was a tremendous person, he said, your success is your suit. You don't need it.
And you'll be surprised that when Mr. Kalam died, all he possessed was 6 shirts, 4 trousers, and 3 suits, those Bandgala suits, because he was a great favorite, very popular on the lecture circuit, so he had to perforce wear. And 1 pair of shoes which he had, worn them off. I mean, the leather was coming off. And his aides were telling me that they kept telling him, and it was very difficult to get him to buy something, because he didn't have too much of time for material things, so they kept telling him, sir, perhaps.
But isn't, Javed, if you look at it, isn't that the irony of destiny? Here was a man who only wanted 1 room. He becomes the president, which is the best real estate you can have. Rashtrapati Bhavan, anywhere, is the best real estate. It has 300 bedrooms. So I asked him at that time, I said, look, you're moving from 1 room to this. He said, no, I will only use 1 room. And that's what he did. And the rest of the rooms he actually converted to activities. The one reason why he became the people's president is he opened out Rashtrapati Bhavan. He not only allowed people to come in, he went out and spoke. And he spoke on development. He spoke on what he's most passionate about. India's development. This was something that he kept right through, even as a scientist. He
loved lecturing. And one of the things that the politicians didn't like about him was that no matter who that politician was, you may be prime minister, you may be the president of your party, you may be the leader in the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha, he used to lecture everybody, yes. From vice president downward, prime minister, governors, chief ministers, everybody got elected. This is not the way legislators should meet, parliament should meet, you should do more work, we should do this, allocate more money for research, for science. So this was something which, which really made them
professor.
Yeah, and it made them very uncomfortable because they are the ones who gave all the bhashans. For once they had to listen to him. And every time he used to talk, he used to speak sense. There is this great anecdote that somebody told me about his meeting with President Musharraf. This was not his forte. Diplomacy was not his forte. So and they thought that Musharraf is going to, he ran circles around Musharraf. He says, what is this? Pakistan, poor country, you need to, you deliver a scientific temper, and he gave him a
gave him a PowerPoint, I'm told.
Yeah, and he told him, he says, I'll make you, and he ran circles for 55 minutes. All that Musharraf did was, his jaw fell open, he was just listening to this.
In fact, when he took over as president, just before that, I'd interviewed him when he was nominated and everyone knew he was there. And I said, look, you were a scientist all your life. What are you doing going into this almost political job? Are you, capable of doing it? Isn't there certain naivety that you have as president, as a scientist to land up in this job? And then he looked at me and he has this classic answer. He says, everything's like a mission. I'm well equipped for it. if I take my task, I can do it. What makes you think I'm inadequate in any of these tasks? If I could do rocket science, there's no reason why I shouldn't be the president and, carrying out the duties. Then I said, what about the dinners? You never like to have dinner, and you'll be all suited and booted. He says, Raj, don't forget, even at dinners, you can work.
Yes, he was apparently, again, from what I gather, he was very conscious of how he spent his time. He'd work 13, 14 hours a day.
If you look back in time, he was always a very hard worker. I know for a fact that in 1994 and much earlier, when I started interviewing him at that time, he would give me time at 1:30 a.m. in the morning. That was because from something like 8 to 9 in the morning till 12:30, he devoted himself. There was nothing else but work for him. There was very rarely that you could see someone with that kind of devotion to work. He was not married, which we joked about. I asked him once, I said, so how come you haven't got married? So he looked at me and he said, we had lots of brothers and sisters and they had lots of children. And so we had too much as a family. So I said, so I thought I should be the brahmachari. That's the kind of thing.
This was a question that was always asked of him. Most of the school children would ask him. And I was at a function and I remember they asked him, and he had this disarming smile. He said, I just never had the time. I wasn't good enough. I just didn't have the time.
Fame chased Kalam wherever he went. Okay, it was not that he reached out to it. He was not in your face.
He was a very private person. Even his personal private life, very few people know about his family life.
And if you go the early influences of his life, here was Kalam who had got it, he wanted to be a pilot. Okay, that was his dream. He landed up in Dehradun for the Air Force interview soon after college, and he failed. He was so disappointed by it. He told me, this was the driving ambition. So he said, if I couldn't fly these machines, I'm going to build them. That is what began his motivation, and he joined this institution, the government, as a junior scientist in the Aeronautical Development Establishment. He wasn't even asked to do anything. He was just idling time, but he was so determined, he started building a hovercraft, which he designed himself. It was this hovercraft that he flew with M.G.K. Menon, another famous scientist, would come visiting, and he said, sir, I'll take you on this thing. And M.G.K. Menon was so, impressed with this young man, who seemed to know what he wanted, in terms of what he wanted to do, that he said, you must join the Space Department. So he spoke to Vikram Sarabhai, who then took him on straight away. Now, he became a Sarabhai favorite. Sarabhai, again, was a great man. He was the founder of Indian Space. Kalam did this early business of launching rockets, carrying the rockets on the cycle. That's the way they lived those days, in real, terrible mosquito-ridden
he must have been there must have been a lot of contemporaries, a lot of others who must have been envious of him.
There was one point, Javed. There was one point where he did fairly well there. Then India was planning to build its first satellite launch vehicle. They needed a project director, and Satish Dhawan was looking for it. Now, there were only 5 other countries that could build it. If India did it, it would be a 6th, and it would have been a major, major achievement for a poor country to be doing it. Over everybody else, Dhawan chose Kalam. Now, there were PhDs from foreign countries that came in, top scientists who were also there in that laboratory, and Dhawan chose Kalam. And you should have seen the resentment that was there. Who was this diploma in engineering coming from Chennai, lands up over there, gets the prime project that everybody would want to do as space scientists, to build the first satellite launch vehicle, and it was Kalam. They actually tried to give him an inferiority complex, but he didn't allow that. He had things that was there. He may not have been formally educated, but when he took over as project director of SLV-3, for instance, he went about it with, people were, he was a transformed person. I asked Dhawan, why did you choose Kalam? He said he's a team man and he's an integrator. So he was ordering all these top scientists, but he was able to get the work done. And then Dhawan taught Kalam the lesson that Kalam told me about. The first time that SLV-3 went up in 1979, the launch vehicle, it tumbled into the Bay of Bengal. It was a failure. Kalam put in his resignation. Dhawan tore his resignation, went out and met the press himself. Dhawan went and said, it is our failure, my failure. He shielded Kalam. Then he went back and told Kalam, put up a rigorous failure system. Check everything that is there, every single component, and a spacecraft can be, 1,000 of them. Don't allow this thing. He did that rigor, came back. Next year, SLV-3 flew, and India made history, and Kalam was history.
India also made history.
But the beauty of it, and this is, we need to recall, and Kalam remembers that, is this time, Dhawan stepped back
and sent Kalam.
Sent Kalam forward, to be the hero. Okay? This is what he learned as a lesson. And he said there were two lessons I learned, Raj, at that time. One, failure need not necessarily thwart you. It is actually a damn good thing to fail on your first attempt, because then you become completely thorough. That changed his life. Two, to understand greatness. Not to just hog. So when when it's team spirit, the leader takes the rap. He doesn't blame it. But when it's success, he allows the individual to do it. He learned that. That was a tremendous lesson for him.
He was known as the people's person, but he was people's president, but he was also known as the missile man. How did all this come about, right?
Javed, that is one of the most astonishing turnarounds that he did for a scientific institution in India. When he took over this Defense Research and Development Laboratory in Hyderabad, it was an organization that never functioned. It couldn't launch the missiles that it wanted to build. Kalam was asked to come and do the dirty job. He did a tremendous job cleaning up, but he did it in his own style. He had tremendous patience. He never swore. The maximum he'd say if he got angry is, "Who's that funny guy?"
Funny guy. That
or "Get me that famous mechanic who did this." That was the maximum he would do. The third thing he did was he brought what he learned from Space Department, the mission mode, to set targets, to get people together, integrate them. And he was almost like a father figure. He would never demand something. He would actually say that, look, I've got this project going. You're an integral member. Can you help me out? And then he told me that he insisted that in every meeting he would be, firstly, not only well prepared, everybody else had to be present. He would follow up. So after a week, he would go back to the same center and say, everybody else has finished their job. Only yours is pending. It looked bad. It looked bad. You do it. So he had this persuasive, gentle style. And but when it came to work, he was firm. He got people to deliver. What he did was amazing, because nobody would want to sell missile technology to India. It helps us launch our nuclear weapons that is there. So he had to build it from scratch. All the critical technologies that was there, he put it together and then motivated this team to do what we now know as Agni, Prithvi, these missiles that we did. And when he finally succeeded, it put again India as one of the 5 or 6 world powers that could do this kind of stuff. And it was this turnaround that actually brought him a lot more acclaim and finally got him the Bharat Ratna, which by 1997 Prime Minister Gujral government gave him.
You must have interacted with him when Pokhran 2 happened. What was his reaction, role?
You see, Pokhran was the sort of zenith of all our nuclear activity. Kalam was one of the prime movers. The atomic energy was doing the core, which is the nuclear core. Kalam, as head of DRDO, was doing two things. One, the entire planning, staging, and everything else. And second, his team was putting the explosives, which he required to crush the core to bring it to critical mass, which then caused.
But he was absolutely convinced, wasn't it, that India needed to go?
He wanted it. He pushed. This was not the first time in 1998 that he pushed. He pushed in 1996. He said we have to have this weapon.
And there's that famous quote of his that strength recognizes strength.
No, and then what he told me, I had this. Here was this man who builds a space vehicle, right? That is for peace. In 1982 or so, he is asked to come and head the Defense Research Project, okay? And that was to build missiles, weapons of destruction. So I asked him, isn't this sort of odd for you?
Yeah.
Here is, you're building weapons, vehicles of peace, and you want to build weapons of war? So he says, not in my mind. If you look at India, for years we were subjugated for what reason? We never had the technology. Today, when I build these missiles, and they carry nuclear warheads, no nation can threaten us. No nation will dare attack us because we have this. And therefore, these are not weapons of war, these are weapons of peace. In fact, there's oxymoron became the title of my book, but this is the way he looked at it. He was fiercely, fiercely patriotic.
There's a line from Wordsworth. Lives of great men remind us we can make our lives sublime. Departing leave behind us footprints in the sands of time. This is so true of President Kalam.
He was a poet, Javed, and he said he did Agni. I think he lit the Agni in all of us.
Absolutely.